Tim Elmore, thank you for joining me today. This is a thrill for me. As I was just mentioning to you, I wrote and released a book just a couple months ago called Make Work Better, and it's a book about workplace culture and organizational health. And I mentioned you, and I mentioned one of the books that you've written and released in the last couple of years in the book. And so you're the first person that I've had on that I've specifically mentioned in the book so thanks for joining me. But for those that don't know, just give me high level who you are and what you do and how you got to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Will, for having me on. It's great to be with you. And it's been fun to work together in the past. We'll probably talk more about that in a little bit. Um, well, I started my career over 40 years ago. So I've been around the block a couple of times, good or bad. And I began my career with John Maxwell. So before John was really even famous in the early 80s, I graduated college and went on staff with him. And I love it because I didn't have to unlearn a lot of bad habits that many young leaders do. I feel like I saw a strong, clear leader right from the beginning. So I worked for John for 20 years, and then I started my own organization called Growing Leaders. And what John was doing for corporate America, leaders in the business world, I wanted to do for the next generation, those who were finishing up school and entering the workplace, but maybe didn't have a clue. They'd mastered the classroom, but not the workroom. And that happens far too often. They make 4.0 GPA and don't have a clue about working as a team, interactions, EQ, those kinds of things. So Growing Leaders celebrates 20 years in 2003. So that was just this last year. And we had a blast. But Will, I think you know this. John Maxwell approached me really in the middle of 2021 and said, "What do you think about merging again?" So we are right now in the process of kind of linking back up. And John explained to me, we've never been known for the next gen. That's not who we are. And that's really what you've been. So we're going to try to lock arms and do more good for the world than we've ever done in the past. So that's my story in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's good. As a matter of fact, so yeah, John Maxwell is kind of our connection. And when I first began to learn about you and your work, I think it was the end of 2021 and the beginning of 2022. You had recently released a book called The Eight Paradoxes of Leadership. And I think I helped promote a book club that you were doing there at the beginning of 2022. But my questions around that book, because this is actually the book that I mentioned that I put on the reading list in my book that people should read. But if we can kind of go back in time a little bit to the eight paradoxes, what was happening or what is happening in culture these days that caused you to write about that topic in the first place?
Yeah. Well, I was noticing that leading people was different than it was at the beginning of my career. And certainly leadership is different post pandemic. I think everybody would automatically nod and go, of course it is. We haven't returned to what we had before. Maybe it's good that we've not returned to what we had before. But I just felt like the leaders that were flourishing in the middle of the pandemic and post pandemic were people that had mastered emotional intelligence, and not just the fundamentals of self-awareness, social awareness, self-management. Those are the fundamentals. But people that began to understand that emotional intelligence is reading your people before you're leading your people. So the paradoxes, Will, in short, are you're reading a situation, and at one point in the day, your people might need confidence from you. And another part of the day, they might need humility from you, which seems oxymoronic, but it's really not. It's just you knowing, what do my people need right now? So that book, Eight Paradoxes, is all about you, not just being one way about your leadership. This is my personality. They better like it. It's more saying, I got to see what my people need and be what they need so we can flourish in the end.
Just had a great interview the other day with a gentleman who is releasing a book in the next month or so. And I realized as I read his book that the bulk of his book is all about like tensions, like acknowledging that within leadership, within organizations, there are these tensions that exist. So what you're describing really sounds like a tension issue. And so my question for you is, because as you know, leaders or people that are in positions of leadership or positions of authority, they have a tendency to go all in and say, I'm going to be nothing but this way, confident for like a year, and let's see how it works out, without really reading the situation as it comes up. So when you've seen a lack of the practice of these paradoxes, what's usually true about organizations that lack those things?
Wow, that's a great question. I would say what I see is that people begin to accumulate distorted narratives in their head, maybe inaccurate narratives about what's really going on. We fill vacuums with our own stories, right or wrong, when we're not quite sure what's happening. And we often, because of our amygdala in our brain, start believing the worst. We get fearful and anxious. So I have a metaphor, Will, that I think best answers that question. I love to teach leadership principles through metaphors, images. The image I use for what I'm about to say, for what I'm trying to say, is dentists and cavities. I know that's random. Here's what I mean. Have you ever noticed when you go to the dentist and the dentist finds a cavity in your mouth, he or she will say, "Ooh, found a cavity. Could you stay a little bit longer right now and I'll fill it right now? Or if not, could you come back as soon as possible so I can fill it?" And we all know the reason they say that is because they know if they don't fill that cavity, something else, like bacteria, is going to fill that cavity. So it is with teams. When leaders don't fill the cavities in our minds with the accurate information, with the right story, the true story of what's really happening, we'll make up stuff because we're anxious. We don't lack IQ, we lack EQ. So I believe when we're not reading our people and reading the situation, the culture, as you mentioned before, we're going to come up with people that, well, smart people could do really dumb things. Can I say that here? And so far too often we say that. So I think the 8 paradox is all about me being very wise in every circumstance I'm in to know exactly what's needed to get the people to the goal.
I think you gave us one of the examples of the 8 paradoxes when you mentioned confidence versus humility. So obviously that's one of them. Can you give us a rundown of that as well as the other 7?
Yeah. Well, Will, thank you for being so for this book. I appreciate it. But I give case studies on each one of these 8 paradoxes. So my case study on confidence and humility was Bob Iger. Here's the CEO of Disney who came into this enterprise, the Disney enterprise. He'd been in network TV, but he'd never led anything as eclectic as Disney that sold plush toys and theme park tickets and movies. So he comes in very humble saying, "Listen, I don't know what we're doing here. Coach me up." And he talked to his own direct reports and they were telling him what he needed to know, but they became for him because he was asking for their help. So he said, "You can't let humility keep you from leading, but you got to come in not pretending that you know everything." So confidence and humility would be number one. Another one was, I think great leaders practice both vision and blind spots. They leverage their vision. We all need a goal, but they also leverage the blind spots that maybe keep experienced leaders from even trying something because they go, "Well, that won't work." Well, sometimes a young leader comes in and goes, "I'm going to give it a shot." And they don't know better. So my case study there was Sarah Blakely, who started Spanx in her 20s before she knew what was going on, but it succeeded because she didn't know the industry she was going into. Another one is, I think great leaders practice visibility and invisibility. So they know when to be present and be visible and model the way. And they also know the moments where they need to get out of the way, get out of the room. So perhaps another leader will step up and do what they need to do. My case study here was Dr. Martin Luther King, who realized after the "I Have a Dream" speech, I need to begin stepping back and letting a young John Lewis step up in that meeting. And John would call him and say, "Dr. King, you're not in the room. We need you here." And he would say, "No, you don't. You know what to say, John. You step up, buddy." And of course, John did. So I just love that one, by the way. I'm in the stage of my career where I need to be more invisible now for my team. Because if I'm in the room, they're going to defer to me. "Dr. Tim, what should we do?" So anyway, that's another one. One of my favorites. I think great leaders are stubborn and open-minded. And Truett Cathy was my illustration there. Dan Cathy, we all know Dan Cathy, the chairman at Chick-fil-A, said, "My dad, who started Chick-fil-A, was the most stubborn man I ever met and the most open-minded man I ever met. But he knew what to be stubborn on, his core, and he knew he needed to be open-minded on everything else in order to adapt and grow." Brilliant. Another one, I think great leaders are deeply personal and yet inherently collective, meaning they know how to be general to let people know, "I get the big picture," but they also know how to speak personally to an audience to say, "I know your struggle and I'm with you on this. I get your life." That's huge. I think great leaders are teachers and learners. I think great leaders have both high standards and gracious forgiveness. So John Maxwell did this for me in my 20s. My gosh, John has excellent standards, and anything short is not acceptable. But I also noticed if I was pushing myself to meet that standard and I failed, he was the first one to step in and forgive and say, let's try it again. So I thought, oh my gosh, it's like a safety net. Push for everything he wants, but I know I'm not going to be fired if in pushing I don't meet the goal. And then the last one, I saved it for last, Will. I think the best leaders I know are both timely and timeless. So they're very current on technology and they're always upgrading the way they get things done, but they've got timeless principles they lead by, and they don't leave those timeless virtues behind. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry I went on so long, but those are the 8 paradoxes I try to cover in the book.
That was perfect. And something that you mentioned that really stood out to me, you mentioned Truett Cathy, and you mentioned what his son Dan said about how he was both stubborn and both the most stubborn person you and the most open-minded person he knew. I see Dan often where I work out of is a place called Trilith here on the south side. You know, Chick-fil-A kind of dominates the south side of Atlanta here. And what's interesting about Dan, I've been able to kind of look and see how he's led through the years, even as he's kind of stepped aside from daily CEO to now, as you mentioned, chairman. And one of the things that made me think of this when you said this is when I think about what's the impact of really good leadership and people that are able to practice these 8 paradoxes. A lot of us would think that the impact is effectiveness or accomplishing something. I'd say it goes beyond that. I would say that good leaders who practice these 8 paradoxes are able to build capacity for even greater things that they may not have even thought of when they started out. I think about, again, Dan Cathy. When he took over as the COO before he was CEO, some number of years ago. Obviously, Chick-fil-A went into more states, more countries than it had ever been before. But now Dan has literally built a city. I'm literally working in the city that he and his partners have built. So I just think in terms of that really good leadership, when practiced, it helps to build capacity for even greater things. So just want to kind of put that in there.
Comment. Excellent comment.
So again, the 8 paradoxes are kind of how I came to know about you, but I think that your next book, A New Kind of Diversity, really puts you on the map. This is a book about generational diversity in the workplace, and your subtitle is Making the Different Generations on Your Team a Competitive Advantage. And so I think this is probably one of the most underlooked at um, issues that we have in the workplace, but everybody feels it. If there's any generational diversity or age diversity in a workplace, people feel it. So, what do you think are some of the most common things that create discord between generations in the workplace?
Wow. Well, there's several, and the reason I think I can say this, and it's data based in my comments, not just opinions, is that seems to be almost all I'm talking about these days. I've been with the NFL in 2023 3 times dealing with this issue. Think about the NFL. Think about men working in the league. They've got a 21-year-old rookie player who's nothing like the 76-year-old football coach he may have, and in fact, that coach could be his granddad, that sort of thing. And so we talk a lot about diversity today, and we need to. Ethnic diversity, gender diversity, income diversity. But I think this generational diversity, Will, is a little bit like an elephant in the room. We all know it's there, we can see it, but we don't know how to talk about it. So it lingers like this big, intrusive, giant. So I think some of the problematic things that happen as a result of it is a Gen Z recent graduate from college joins the team, has very different assumptions about how work should look, very different communication styles, do they not? They're wanting to text message or I am the boss, and they want check-ins every day, multiple times a day. And the boss is going, I'm not going to check on you, Josh, that sort of thing. So quite frankly, if I can just be really candid, I see frustration on both sides. That 20-something that says, what the heck? How can this dinosaur that's leading this organization realize we're going to die? And of course, the dinosaurs get this young whippersnapper, kids today. And they refer to Gen Z as fragile snowflakes. Come on, we've all heard that. So here's what my goal in this book, and whenever I speak on this topic, is to help organizations turn their frustration into fascination. I am now fascinated by the Gen Z members at Growing Leaders. Cam's 22, 23 years old. I love what I learned from him, but I go in as a learner. Now, do I have something to teach? Of course I do. My 44-year career, I've got a couple of things I've learned. But I'm telling you, if I go in as a learner, he becomes a learner. He reciprocates the very spirit that I lead with. So I'm going to stop there, but this is a thing. We've got to figure it out. And I'm afraid too many are just digging their heels in rather than saying, I'm going to turn my frustration into fascination with these other people.
Oh yeah, when you first came out with this book, I mean, you got my attention right away because I remember, and this has been less so since I've been a consultant, although I've been a deeply embedded consultant at several organizations, including Maxwell, which has some generational diversity, obviously. But I can remember working for one organization for about 10 years, and for the bulk of that 10 years, I was the only person in my generation. I'm Generation X. At the time, I was, I think, 27 to 37, 28 to 38, something like that. And everyone else that worked there, as you might can guess, was a baby boomer. And by the way, I think you're technically a baby boomer. You're like you're like barely a boomer. Now, these
Yep,
people are
I'm
at
a
the
tweener.
top end. Yeah, right.
Yes.
Yeah, because you're within that margin of error. Well, all the people that I worked with were at the top end of the boomer generation, and some of them I could have been builders mentally. But yeah, I'm right kind of smack dab in the middle, I think, of Gen X. 1976. So I'm kind of, I think Gen X started a few years before I was born. But I can tell you that the generational differences were very stark. Now, here's what's funny though. All the things you were describing about Gen Z nowadays in the workplace was a little bit me, not so much. But then I ended up going to work for a place where I was the average 5 years older than everybody. I think we're all technically the same generation, but because I'd
Yeah.
been around true boomers for so many years, they kind of saw me as a boomer because I picked up a lot of the preferences and styles and whatever was expected of boomers. So I think, and we'll talk about this in a minute. There's a great assessment for called the generational quotient, in which I actually ended up scoring as I identify more with boomers than Xers. So anyway, um, but one thing I want to mention too, because we talked a little bit earlier regarding the eight paradox about tensions, and one of the chapters in A New Kind of Diversity is all about managing preferences, tensions, and expectations. So, what makes each of these so challenging, yet so beneficial for leaders to manage?
Thank you, Will, for asking that. I hope I do justice with this answer. I love that chapter. In fact, that chapter may be the one that's most helpful if people said, I'm going to use this like an encyclopedia and just read one part or two parts, because beginning in the job interview, the HR exec or the hiring manager needs to begin to figure out the expectations, the preferences. In fact, can I add sometimes the demands of a Gen Z free agent that comes in expecting or demanding this, and you need to figure that out and go, you know what, we are not your place, buddy. I got to lead you to the door and pray for you that you're going to find another job somewhere else. So real quick, I think everybody in a job interview brings in some expectations, the assumptions of how work is going to be. I think it's good to talk about those, and often as a hiring manager, say, here's how we look. Does that suit you okay? Because if it doesn't, tell me now. I believe conflict expands based on the distance between expectations and reality. So well, here's the illustration I always give. If I tell my wife I'm going to be home at 7 for dinner and I get home at 7:10, not a big deal. If I get home at 9:30, that's a big deal. And it's not because my wife can't live without me for 2.5 hours. It's because I established an expectation that was not the reality. So I think leaders need to figure this out. You don't have to be perfect leaders, but be honest about here's our imperfections. Can you live with this? So we all have preferences. I prefer it to be this way, but if it's not, I'm okay. We'll have expectations. That's a little stronger. And then quite frankly, I think we sometimes bring in demands, particularly post 2020, where we began to polarize even more as a nation. Black Lives Matter, which is a great cause, but boy, did we not polarize over how we were going to respond to that issue. So I'm afraid that now we're digging our heels in on issues that probably are preferences, but we act like they're demands. These are emotional, intelligent issues. So I'm going to make a statement for hopefully that's helpful to your listeners. Social skills appreciate over time. Technical skills depreciate with time, but we don't act like it. Isn't it true? You learn a technical skill in college, 5 years later, it's it's no longer applicable. We got to relearn. I think you build social skills, interpersonal skills, they never go away. And I think the higher you go in your organization, the higher your EQ needs to be. That's my belief.
One of the things too, when I think about preferences, because again, this is a big deal. One of the cultural values at one of the, I guess, probably better organized places I've dealt with or worked within, there was out of their five core values, one of them was we don't take ourselves too seriously. And under each of these values, there were subpoints that were varied, but they all kind of fit under that main point. One of the ones I remember was for we don't take ourselves too seriously is we relax on our preferences. So when you think about people that bring preferences into a workplace, and there is almost an expectation for every single person that they work with to have that same preference or to abide by their preference. And I've seen this also. You mentioned some of the views that popped up, especially around 2020, but even before that, where if you'd be in a place and there would be preferences that were not critical to the work that was being done. That weren't even really critical at all. But there was this it was almost like they would deify or doctrinize their preferences. It's like, wait a minute, folks. People are bringing different viewpoints, different backgrounds, different perspectives. Why are we making this a central thing? Anyway, I've noticed that that has been an issue in more than one place that I have worked within. So I'm glad you addressed that in your book.
You bet.
So on, I mentioned this earlier. There is a free assessment that to this point, I think tens of thousands of people, including leaders, have taken called the Generational Quotient or GQ assessment. Can you tell me more about what insights that assessment gives?
Yeah, sure. So as part of the book, we decided to create an evaluation or an assessment that will allow you to respond to the 41 questions and then see, ooh, I'm pretty good with the Xers, but not so good with millennials, or I'm pretty good with builders, but not good with Gen Z. So it's been rather fun. I mean, it's not hyper scientific, but it just gives you a feel for, oh, you're going to manage these people probably pretty easily with a lot of things in common. But maybe these people, you're going to have to do the work of a cross-cultural relationship. So, Will, I love this metaphor. If you and I hopped on a plane and flew to China, let's say, we would automatically hop off that plane in China being psyched up to work really hard to connect with people in that country. Why? Different language, different customs, different values. Bingo. When I talk to someone from Gen Z, I got to work as hard as I would in another country because they'll have different language, different customs. And I'm afraid that sometimes we don't want to work that hard. Let's be honest. In our 50s and 60s, I don't want to work that hard. This is how it is. And I think I give up some of that brilliant talent that a 20-something brings in because I'm not willing to do the work. This happens at family reunions. It happens in workplaces. So I am on a war path to help the generations not just tolerate each other, but leverage the strengths of each other along the way.
That's really good. Question two. What workplace trends are you seeing right now with Gen Z specifically that might be surprising to a Gen Xer like me?
All right. So this is not everywhere, but this is a rising trend. It's the democratization of the workforce, the democratization of the workforce. So a Gen Zer comes in with usually with a couple of qualities that are oxymoronic, a high sense of agency and a high sense of anxiety. So the agency comes from the smartphone because I can look up an answer with a Google reflex and I feel like I know what I'm doing when I'm 22. And the boss goes, "You don't know what you're doing, Bobby." You know, but there's a high sense of agency. They feel like they don't need to wait. They got the answer. Will, I just had a high school senior say this to me. My teachers are obsolete. Isn't that interesting? And he wasn't being disrespectful. He was just saying, I can look up everything they say to me in the classroom. So the high sense of agency or empowerment comes from, wow, they've looked up stuff since they were 11 years old. But then there's this weird, I shouldn't say weird. It's weird to older people, though. High sense of anxiety. They're just anxious and having panic attacks and maybe mental health issues that have been normalized today. Listen, don't we all hear about mental health issues as a norm? So I think hiring managers and employers need to get ready. They're going to be very audacious. I just heard from an attorney who interviewed a Gen Z candidate, and the Gen Z candidate 15 minutes into the job interview said, "I'm going to have your job in 18 months." Probably not a good thing to say to the hiring manager in the interview there, but she felt like it would come across confident. It came across as arrogant, and he dismissed her. So we got to come together. We got to meet in the middle. So I think that would be my answer. High sensitivity. Get ready for a wow. They're audacious in what they think they can pull off, but they're also very anxious. So one moment you need to say, let me empower them to do something entrepreneurial at our team. On the other hand, they might need an arm around the shoulder saying, hey, you're going to be okay. You're going to be just fine with that anxiety. And by the way, I'm going to point out, I think both of these, agency and anxiety, were brought on by the smartphone. So I'll stop there.
Absolutely. Remind me, because not only have I read your book and I reference it all the time, but you've given lots of talks on this subject, including to some very key and large audiences. And I think you mentioned, I either heard this in one of your talks or read it in the book, that is right now the millennial generation the largest generation represented in the workforce. Is that correct? And then now, so we know that's true, but we also know that the Gen Zers are the most emerging generation. They're the ones that everybody's having to adjust to. Because I think most people have kind of adjusted to the millennials now. Now it's just like, people are still adjusting to the Gen Z generation. Here's what I love about it. So in your book, you have a section, you have a chapter titled "The Contribution of the Coronials," which is, you have a nice additional like tagline or nickname for each of the generations. And you mentioned Generation Z, or the Coronials here. But you have something that I think is, and it's in a gray shaded box. It's absolutely wonderful. I'm not going to ask you to list them off because it would be unfair for me to say, can you remember these exact 12 things you mentioned in a 300-page book? But it is steps for connecting with and leading Generation Z. I'm just going to mention a few of them here. The first one is listen to them and affirm their dreams and goals. The next is provide them with a sense of purpose as they perform sometimes menial tasks. Because when we think about, like, there are lots of Gen Z are in entry level positions, that's going to be a foregone conclusion. Then give them short-term commitments they can keep and put wins under their belts. And the last one I'll mention out of these 12 things is help them to focus on one meaningful objective and pull it off. And you've got several other things in here that my suggestion is every leader should have this book, because you have, again, multiple generations represented. The Gen Zers are not going to stop entering the workforce, right? So if we don't learn now to adjust to them, we'll never learn. But they should turn to page 159 in this book and learn these 12 things and practice them with everyone on their team that's Generation Z. Anyway, that's my recommendation to every leader that's listening to this right now. So you have a brand new book out. It just came out, as a matter of fact, called "I Can't Wait," and it's a very different book from your other books. Tell us, without me giving away, how is this different from your other books, and tell the audience what makes it different.
Thanks for asking that. Well, it is a wildly different book because it's a book in many ways for families. Not that the leadership stuff I've written aren't for people that have families, but it's more for the workplace. This one, I just wanted to change the narrative that so many of us as adults have about young people. So, the proverbial phrase, kids today. Well, we've been saying kids today as adults way back since Socrates. If you read what Socrates wrote about kids are disrespectful to parents in my day, and they're not going to make it, blah, blah, blah. And I'm going, oh my gosh, that could have been written last week. So we teamed up with Harris Poll Interactive, and we surveyed over 2,000 adults across the country in the US. And we wanted to find out what kind of narrative adults have about the emerging generation, which at the time, Gen Z. Well, it was a little bit sad. 2 out of every 3 people have a negative emotion come to mind, not a positive emotion, when they think about kids. Like, I'm fearful for them, I'm concerned for them. And that's well-intentioned, but can you imagine what it feels like to be 15 or 16, look up at all the grown-ups? I'm fearful for you, I'm concerned. That is not very empowering, And then almost 2 out of every 3, about 65%, believe that Generation Z is not going to be ready for the workforce when it's time. So I thought to myself, what if I created a resource that moms and dads or teachers or employers could read? It's 52 stories of kids who changed their world that you can discuss together. So I talk about Virgil, this 13-year-old kid that saved 17 lives in Hurricane Harvey. I talk about Ann Makasinski, who at 16 years old had a Facebook pal in the Philippines who flunked her grade in school because she lived in a home that didn't have electricity. And so when the sun went down, she couldn't do her homework. So Anne, who loves science, invented a flashlight that was powered by the body heat from your hand, didn't need a battery. And she sent it over to her friend. This is what kids do, you know? This is called, blind spots and vision both. She sends it over and her friends started flourishing. Well, Anne won science awards. She's created flashlights, headgear with lights on it, powered by body heat. The book is filled with stories that will change up, I think, the narrative we have about young people and say, I better start investing in these kids because they're going to take over the world, ready or not, like it or not. So I picture families at dinner time reading one story a week for a whole year. In fact, this is a great 2024 New Year's resolution. Read one story a week for a whole year. Talk about it with your 12-year-old, 13-year-old, whatever. There's 3 discussion questions at the end of each short chapter. And then there's a link that you can go to a website and watch a little video on each of these kids. So anyway, I'll stop there. That was my hope and my dream when I created this book. I can't wait. Yeah.
Yeah, so the book is I Can't Wait. For those that can't wait to get it, where can they get the book?
Well, you can go on Amazon for sure anytime you want a book. But we have a fun special site. It's ican'twaitbook.com, ican'twaitbook.com, where you can get the book. And that's where you can find those videos too. So for free, you can just watch the little videos. And what I built, Will, my heartbeat on this, because I love the next generation. I have for all the years I've been in my career, is to create a platform of belief. You just said it or not, Gen Z is the emerging generation. Millennials are already taken over. By 2030, 70% of the workforce is millennials and Gen Z. And then Gen Alpha will be coming on. We can't say kids today. We need to say, oh my gosh, I've got to get them ready and pass the baton. Think about Washington, D.C. right now. No disrespect to the Republicans and Democrats there. You know what the average age is running our country in D.C.? It's ridiculous. It's like mid to late 70s. Our president's 80. I'm going, why have you not passed the baton to a 50-year-old or 45-year-old and gotten them ready to serve in Congress or in the White House? So I'm sorry, I'm ranting and raving now, but we have got to take this job seriously. And this book is hopefully a tool at dinner time or bedtime to make this happen.
Yeah, I look at things often through the lens of generational diversity now when it comes to workplace culture and workplace health, organizational health. And okay, not necessarily we, but I often am thinking of the baby boomer generation. Oh, that's that generation that hasn't quite fully retired again. Because again, you're a tweener, so I'm not really disrespecting you here. But then, yeah, I did think the other day, I thought, yes, the president of the United States isn't even a baby boomer. It's one generation removed.
Oh, I know. It's crazy. Well, the last time I checked the data, about 10,000 baby boomers are retiring on average every day. So they're going to leave vacuums. They were probably in some management position, maybe leading the company. I don't know. But I'm just saying that vacuum is going to need to be filled by Xers, by millennials, by Gen Z. We need to be obsessed with getting them ready and passing the baton. I think post 40, I need to be looking around going, who are the younger leaders on the staff that I can begin to have lunch with or coffee with and just begin to share what I know. I think we need to practice reverse mentoring, where half the time I'm pouring into them, half the time they're pouring into me because the age of authority is dropping. So I think reverse mentoring ought to be taking place every week in every office. That's just my opinion, and I'm sticking to it.
Reverse mentoring is something that, thanks to you and thanks to the fact that you've taught this, it's something that I started recently. And so there's someone who is rather accomplished that's 14 years younger than me, I think, or somewhere in there, that I now have a weekly. It's just a random, like, hey, let me tell you what I'm learning and thinking, and let me just bounce this off you. And I want to get their perspective because, again, I come into every situation with a generational bias. right? And speaking of that, so your book, New Kind of Diversity, which we've talked a lot about already, but there's something I want to go back to. It's a book about generational diversity, but I think the problem that it addresses are generational differences in the workplace, right? So you tell a story. I've heard you tell the story, and I've attended quite a few of your talks. I've heard you tell it at least twice, and I think it's very compelling. But if you can tell us, because I think it tells us a lot about, yes, the problem, but then also how people can creatively go about solving the issue of the generational differences. And that it's a story of a fast food hire and visible tattoos.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I do put this story in the book. So Antonio was in his 20s, and he was interviewed by Maggie, the hiring manager at this restaurant chain. And Maggie really liked Antonio. He had a little bit of experience in fast food restaurants. He seemed to be a good, excuse me, a good worker, good work ethic. And so she began to walk through the values and the policies of the restaurant before she made the official hire. He agreed to all of them. So Maggie hires Anthony. A few weeks later, they're both serving on the same shift, Maggie and Anthony. He's got the short sleeve shirt on, and she sees tattoos up and down his arm. Well, it's not criminal, except that at this restaurant chain, there was a policy that says no tattoos. And what made Maggie upset was not so much that he had tattoos, but he wasn't honest about it. He didn't say, "Oh, by the way, I should tell you, look at my right arm, and what should we do about this?" So Maggie was a little bit put off. She takes Antonio to her back office a little bit later, and very gently, I might add, begins to broach the subject and says, "Why didn't you talk to me about that?" Well, Antonio was offended because this tattoo is a part of his identity. And for many Gen Zers, the piercings, the tattoos, the haircuts, all part of their identity. Nothing wrong with that, except that I tend to believe the older you get, the more identity is derived from the inside, not the outside. But that's another webcast for another day. So they began to debate this issue, and they reach an impasse. They meet a second time, reach an impasse. Finally, on the third meeting, I am so proud of how Maggie negotiated this impasse. She said, "Antonio, we have a policy. You knew it from the beginning. You weren't honest with me. However, I really like you, and your team members like you, and your work ethic is great, and you serve the customers so well. I don't want to lose you. So what if you and I stood in front of our entire team the next time we have a staff meeting, and we both acknowledge and confess our flaws, our faults, and we see if we can, reconcile this whole thing?" Well, they did this. I mean, Maggie, the boss, even said, "Maybe I wasn't as clear as I needed to be. I thought she was, but maybe it wasn't as clear as I needed to be." He said, "I'm so sorry I wasn't honest. Please forgive me." And here's the agreement they made. He was going to stay, but wear long sleeve shirts underneath the uniform. She decided she was going to call corporate and say, "Is there any way we could change that policy in the future?" Got a standing ovation from the team. And I thought this is the brilliant type of leadership that's needed today with a new generation that does not think like somebody over 50, but yet we can't lose them and dig our heels in on stuff that probably isn't eternal. So anyway, I'll stop there, Will, but I just love it, love it, love it when I meet leaders that put relationships right up there next to results. We need both, but we can't give up relationships. That's just what makes the world go around, I think.
I agree wholeheartedly. I think too, so this is something I've noticed. Again, if I just go back in time, say when I entered the workforce, which was 25 years ago, there were things, say, even 20, even 15 years ago, that were non-negotiables when it came to how you showed up to work. They were non-negotiables in one direction.
Yep.
Nowadays, it's almost like they're non-negotiables in the other direction. It's like, you mentioned the practical example of the visible tattoos policy. And for even now, there are plenty of organizations, companies, chains that practice that or that have that as a policy. But more and more, we're seeing the whole, what do you mean I can't show up to work and have a visible tattoo? So it's just the opposite. So it's almost like things are getting flipped on their head. I want to go back to something that we talked about earlier because I think again the eight paradoxes that one tensions. It just happens to be one of the subjects that I've become obsessed with because I'm seeing it as core to leadership. And I'm going to tell you why. It's because about 10 years ago, I read a book about organizational turnarounds. It was by a guy named Dr. Mark Rutland, and he was known in a very specific nonprofit space for helping to turn around well-known organizations within the Christian ministry space. And he wrote something that I have never, I mean, it's the one thing that I remember from his book, and I remember the stories from his book too, but the one thing that he said that always stood out to me is that he said, when a lot of people come in and they decide they're going to do a turnaround or they're going to build something from scratch, leaders often think of like building things, like making a plan, getting raw materials and building things. He said, when it comes to effective organizational leadership, he said it's less about building things and it's more about managing tensions. And what he talks about in his book is that in any organization, whether it's for profit or not for profit, you have two energies at play. One is called chaos, and the other is control. He said, chaos, these are your leaders, your creators, your producers, these salespeople. On the other side, you have control. These are your accountants, your lawyers, et cetera. And he said, there's always a continuum there. There's always a spectrum. And he said, good leaders know where to put the most weight and make sure that things are in balance so that the right amount of chaos gets done and things actually get produced and things get sold, but there's enough control to, to keep from bankruptcy and criminal charges and everything else from happening. So again, I
Yeah.
love the idea of eight paradoxes because it falls into that. If there is and of course you mentioned them all, and you mentioned, you start off mentioning confidence and humility, but if there is something, if there's one of those eight paradox tensions that you've noticed as you've been consulting with companies or organizations, you're like, man, this is one that I'm seeing become more and more an issue as far as companies lack it. And that if they put it into practice, it would really help them get from where they are to where they want to be.
Yeah, I go back to I think great leaders are both stubborn and open-minded. The way I talk about tensions, Will, is this. Every organization has problems to solve and tensions to manage, and you got to treat them differently. Problems do need to be solved. We need to get rid of that thing, resolve it, etc. Tensions are going to be with us all the time. I think, in my opinion, there's always going to be at least a slight tension between sales and fulfillment or operations. These people are selling like crazy, making stuff up sometimes. That's happened to the Maxwell organization a couple of times. But then fulfillment's going, wait a minute, that's not, blah, 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 blah. And so you get the point. There's different divisions in every company that has to do different tasks. Sometimes people are wired differently, but I think we're never going to completely get rid of the tension between sales and operations. So we need to know it's just there. Stop getting mad at Bob or Susan and learn to live with this and manage the tension. So that liberated me, like you just said with Mark Rutland. That just liberated me to go, okay, I don't need to get rid of this. I need to live with it and make it work for us. So that's, I think, a good leader, what a good leader has to learn to do.
It's funny that you mentioned that example of sales versus fulfillment, because that is a tension I have seen and it seems to be paramount. It seems to be the noisiest tension of all the organizations I've been involved in.
It's so true. It's so true. So yeah, stubborn and open-minded. I think I need to know there are a few things I need to be stubborn about. It's not a tension. It's something we just need to all get this way. We need to align in this. Sales and operation. We need to align about this issue. But then so many of the others, I've just got to be open and help people adapt, maybe not adopt, but adapt to the new realities. And I just think this is the new day in which we lead. And it just requires me to be very self-aware and socially aware, not just good strategy and good speaker, at the annual meeting. So yeah.
Awesome. What's next on the horizon for you?
Well, I mentioned before, we are in the middle of a merge, Growing Leaders and Maxwell Leadership Foundation. So we're really about transforming the world. I know that seems gigantic and almost overly idealistic, but we really want to get values-based leadership tools in the hands of young and old. So that's kind of the next thing on the horizon for me. I'm doing a lot more in the business world, talking about new kind of diversity, talking about eight paradoxes. And it's been fun for me to begin to help bridge the gap between that new Gen Zer and the builder or the Xer or the boomer that's in charge and just gets a little frustrated instead of fascinated at the young people.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to suggest to all the listeners here that they need to get all three of your books, or at least the ones that I'm familiar with. You have more than three books, obviously, but A New Kind of Diversity, which we've talked about a lot here, as well as The Eight Paradoxes of Leadership. And as you said, all books are available on Amazon, but they can also get those books as well as your newest one, I Can't Wait, from the maxwellleadership.com store as well. So thanks again for joining me. This has been fantastic. And next time you come out with your next new book, let's definitely do this again, and we'll talk some more about your new book, and we'll talk about some things we didn't talk about regarding your existing books as well. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet. Will. Great to be with you.